Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending upon where you are. And welcome to this panel on spectrum management. It's genuinely my pleasure to be joined by this esteemed panel that has been put forward here today. And it represents a mix of both regulators and industry and the private sector. And I think it provides a really good opportunity for us to explore some of the challenges and issues around spectrum management that we see today and that we anticipate that we may see further going forward. So my name is Chris Walford. I'm the Director of International Spectrum Policy at Ofcom. I'm also a Director at the IIC. So let me first introduce my panel. So firstly, I have Elif Yenahan, who is the Access Network Capabilities Director at Turkcell. I'm delighted to be joined by Jennifer Warren, who is the Vice President for Technology Policy and Regulation at Lockheed Martin. Eric Fournier, who is the Director for Spectrum Planning and International Affairs at ANFR, the French spectrum regulator. And William Webb, former President of the Institute of Engineering and Technology, and now the Chief Executive Officer of Web Search Limited. So thank you very much for joining me today. And I think this is a really sort of timely panel because we all know that demand for access to spectrum is increasing. And that's demand from existing spectrum users who are always looking for access to more spectrum to provide more services and to meet increasing demands. But also we're seeing new use cases emerging all the time. And the question really, I think, for the panel over the next hour or so is, what does this mean for how we manage spectrum going forward? And in many respects, this is not a new problem. I mean, we've been discussing things like spectrum sharing, market mechanisms, and various mechanisms that are out there to try and improve the efficient use of spectrum. We've been having those conversations for a number of years, but I think, to me at least, it's clear there's no single answer to all of this. There's no magic bullet that's going to allow us to suddenly improve spectrum efficiency. And there may also be some problems and some challenges with some of the mechanisms that have been identified. So the question and the challenge for the discussion today really is, to think about how spectrum regulation and approaches to spectrum management may need to evolve over the next decade. And some of the issues that we might consider in respect of that are things around how new services are likely to impact future demand for spectrum, and that includes things like 5G. How we can balance the needs of existing users against the various demands from new applications and services that require access to spectrum. How can we balance the need to promote innovation while also ensuring that we're providing the security and the certainty that major investment decisions require? And what does all this mean for how we approach authorizing access to spectrum and the different mechanisms and the ways we have of making spectrum available? So with that in mind, let me turn to my panelists now. And if I could perhaps start with the industry side of things, or let me start with Elif and Jennifer, and ask you how you see your spectrum needs evolving. So Elif, starting with you, I mean, you're there as a representative of the mobile industry or the mobile sector. I mean, what do you see as your anticipated spectrum needs for the future? And given things like the anticipated take-up of 5G, how do you expect these sort of future spectrum needs to be met?
Thank you, Chris. It's for sure that spectrum is a very limited and precious resource for all operators. And in mobile networks, by the way, we are in Turkcell at the moment serving with LTE, and we are going forward to 5G. And in the mobile industry, we are always, as you mentioned, facing increasing demand in data traffic. And also the technology drives this demand, together with the customers, of course. The service quality is also driving. New services, new applications, they're also driving the demand. And to meet this demand, you need to have a good spectrum asset as an operator. So with 5G, even this is going further. Up to now, we have been dealing with 5 to 10 to 20 megahertz of spectrum packages, let's say. But from now on, together with 5G, we will need more bandwidth, 100 megahertz bandwidth, for example, a continuous spectrum, to be able to serve better to our customers, and regarding these new services, of course. So it's scarcity is getting really at the critical level. There are, of course, let's say, openings in the new spectrums like mid-band. We are really taking it, considering it seriously, the mid-band spectrum for 5G. It's the most critical band at the moment. And also there are efforts for having new spectrum in these mid-bands for 5G, because it's for sure that it will be utilized. And there is a coverage and capacity balance in these mid-band spectrums. So they are the most valuable ones for us. And again, as I mentioned before, it will be on behalf of our customers, for the quality of service to our customers. And as 5G will become mainstream, by 2025, let's say, because it's expected to have around 40–50% share in terms of accessing terminals, the 5G will be the mainstream. And for a mainstream technology, you need to have dedicated resources. So I believe that it's again critical for operators that we have licensed spectrum to serve in, first of all, the most critical mid-bands in 5G. And so how do we introduce, as you asked, new spectrum? How can we introduce new spectrum? Yes, there are some parts of the spectrums are utilized at the moment by several industries, but it's possible to free up some more space for mobile, I believe. And also in higher spectrums, there are opportunities. Higher spectrums are also dedicated and also being worked on to be accessible for mobile. These are the opportunities, I guess. And every WRC meeting, of course, with all the regulators and the industry representatives, they are being discussed, and the decisions are given there. So as we are approaching 5G, I believe at the moment, the spectrum is okay, but in the future, new resources will be necessary. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Elif. So let me ask the same question to Jennifer, but obviously now from the satellite perspective. I mean, what do you see as the anticipated future needs of the satellite sector, and how do you anticipate those may be met?
So first of all, let me thank IIC and you, Chris, for inviting me to be on this panel with my colleagues. It's such an important topic because usually, we don't talk first about spectrum governance. We talk about specific, unique demands, but you've set this up in a much broader context, which I think is really worthy of conversation. So I'm going to broaden it slightly, satellite as an element of the larger space spectrum needs. And even the space industry is really looking forward to the transition from 4G to 5G, anticipating, what those new use cases and applications may be, and the role that satellite, non-terrestrial network can play in the larger 5G ecosystem. So even, satellite has something to contribute to the future state of 5G. But if we look at, if we put aside terrestrial wireless for a moment and look at space uses of spectrum, the technological innovations that are happening in space are leading to expectations of an entire new economy. I mean, we actually have language that talks about a space economy. Bank of America reported last year, I think in October, that it expects that the space economy, the global space economy, will reach $1.4 trillion in a decade. So this is something coming. It's not the state of today, but when you look at all the different figures that are out there about what the space economy will look like, what's the relevance to spectrum? It means that there's multiple demand pools for spectrum from a very non-homogeneous spectrum industry. It's not 5G. It is from not only stakeholders that are industry, universities, amateurs, scientists, but it includes, as I said, such a non-homogeneous set of I'll call them services. So there's the obvious that we all talk about in the case of satellite, next gen broadband SATCOM can be NGSO systems, satellite IoT, new ground system capabilities to support all sorts of different systems and uses such as commercial UAS by satellite. For those not familiar with UAS, commercial unmanned aerial systems. If you think long haul autonomous cargo transport by air or by sea, right? These are all future from a comms and C2 perspective. But if you think more broadly about the space economy, what we're talking about is climate services, from weather to carbon monitoring, to remote sensing, to cislunar needs, which is, I think, really interesting as we start to think about the jurisdictional reach of our institutions that are focused on spectrum governance, right? Commercial moon surface comms, robotic comms on the moon, commercial habitats. You can tell I kind of get excited about some of this. Commercial space transportation, space tourism. And then a common element, they all need to be launched, right? They've got to get into space. So launch spectrum. And I mean, at the FCC right now, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, there's an ongoing proceeding that's looking at roughly 300 megahertz in various frequency bands that are being considered right now for different aspects of launch and launch related support for spectrum. So again, as I said, our demand growth, I can't say it's in a given band or even two bands because we're not a homogeneous industry. We're not one industry serving a set of wireless consumers. We don't have that luxury, unfortunately. And our industry isn't yet defined. We don't know who will be the private astronauts. We don't know who will do Airbnb in space and want to be able to Wi-Fi back home, right? Or Wi-Fi to another habitat. For us, the focus really is, we know the demand is there. We are being constrained, typically, unfortunately, by regulators to accommodate other services. And we've got to figure out, how do we meet the huge demand signals that I've just flagged, and how do regulators incentivize? We can talk about this perhaps a little bit later. How do regulators incentivize OEMs across the spectrum stakeholder community to invest today in the R&D that's going to be necessary to make anything meaningful happen in terms of spectrum sharing? Because terrestrial and non-terrestrial, we've got to figure this out. And it's in the interest of the citizens of the world, not just our parochial interests. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So really interesting, some really interesting points there. We can certainly come back to those. I'm not sure we'll solve quite the problem of sort of spectrum access on the moon, but that's probably a jurisdiction outside the UK. But we'll park that one for a later date. But we'll certainly come back to some of those issues. So Eric, I mean, I think the good news is that there's loads of innovation out there. There's loads of interesting stuff going on. I mean, we've just spoken about the mobile and the satellite space side of things, both of which, as I say, there's huge amounts of stuff that's happening. I I mean, the slightly more challenging aspect of this is that all this requires access to spectrum. So from a regulator's perspective, I mean, how do you think these increasing demands are likely to be met? Because, you know, my own experience is there's not exactly loads of spare spectrum out there at the moment.
That's correct, Chris. And in fact, your question is very general. It is what means spectrum management. What is spectrum management? And obviously, one principle in spectrum management is that we do not have to choose between user and to say this one is more important, mobile is more important than satellite, or vice versa. So what we are doing is that we are addressing all demand, all spectrum demand, and trying to find a solution for each of them. So obviously the situation is complex. I have just behind me the spectrum allocation in France, and you can see that bands are like puzzle pieces, and we have to move these puzzle pieces and to increase the third dimension, maybe, which is a sharing, to ensure that at the end everybody can find a spectrum in which to operate. So obviously mobile spectrum in the last decades was the most disruptive. I think now below 4 gigahertz, there's something like 1 gigahertz of spectrum, which is for mobile, and that's really disruptive. 25% of the spectrum, and it was almost nothing in the 1980s. So it's really tremendous. But of course, and that was mentioned by Jennifer, we have also to address all the various part of spectrum demand of satellites, satellite for communication, radio navigations, scientific. It's very different type of demand from the satellite side, and also other users, aeronautical, defense, meteorology. We have a lot of demand like this that we need to accommodate. So we are really doing things in an incremental way. If you see what we have done for 5G in Europe, we have identified frequency band 3.5 gigahertz, the primary band, the 26 gigahertz, the pioneer band in the millimeter wave, the 700 megahertz, of course, and we have managed to ensure coexistence with other users. We have migrated few increments, but not so much. And for 6G, when we'll have the demand soon, I'm sure Elif would wish some spectrum for 6G, we will be able to do it. And in fact, we have already started to work on that in preparation, maybe of WRC27 and of the date of 2030, where we are expected to see the IMT 2030. And that's the same for satellite. We are taking care of current developments, the new needs. If I take the example of broadband communication for mobile, we have in Europe paid much attention to safeguard the Ka band, in particular the uplink in 28 gigahertz. That's why we have identified 5G in 26 gigahertz instead, because we know it's vital for satellite broadband, and we are now preparing. You are working on that at the ECC level, Mr. Chairman. We are working also on new satellite spectrum in QV band in the 40, 50 gigahertz, because this is a new future band for satellite communication, and organizing coexistence with other usage, such as the second millimeter wave band for 5G, which will be in the same range of spectrum in the 40 gigahertz. So at the end, I hope, I mean, in the last decades, I think we have been able to identify spectrum for all users. We will continue to do that, and sometimes there are some constraints, some sharing, and maybe we are not satisfying all possible dream, but I think we are at least accommodating all spectrum users.
Okay, thanks for that, Eric. So on the subject of all spectrum users, I mean, we've had from the mobile sector and then the satellite sector, but of course there's lots of other users out there that also want to access spectrum. I mean, not least the license exempt community, which is often, you know, one of the areas and real drivers of innovation. And we all know how important Wi-Fi is and things like that. So let me ask that question to William now about, you know, are our current approaches to spectrum management sufficient to meet all these future needs from all the diverse potential users of spectrum over the next decade or so?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and to some degree, you made the point, and Eric made it too, that it's, in some respects, this is not new. We've had increasing demand from mobile for 30 years now. We've had all sorts of other demand areas that have come up and gone, and mobile TV was big once, and fixed wireless access sort of comes and goes a bit, and so on. So the concept of lots of people wanting more spectrum is not a new one. And you can imagine that essentially regulators might do the same thing they've always done, which basically is, to some degree, move people to higher bands that can be moved. That's often the fixed links users. Get some spectrum back from people who either are suspected of having too much, often the government is put into that bracket, or who look like they actually need less. And of course, the TV broadcasters have been a key element in that in the recent years. And then potentially look at sharing, and we'll come and talk more about sharing, so I won't talk a lot about that at this point in time. So you can see how that unfolds, but it all feels very interventionist, and it all feels very confrontational. I think that's the key problem, that you end up with these huge debates where 6 gigahertz has been a recent one you talked about. The mobile community says we must have this, otherwise the world will end if we don't. The licensed community says if we don't have this, then people won't be able to do anything in their homes and Wi-Fi will collapse. And you get this kind of excessively confrontational element that the regulator has to sit in the middle of and essentially adjudicate between the two of those and come to some judgment. And I think it's very difficult for the regulator, or anyone indeed, to come to a clear and rational and evidence-based judgment on things that are going to happen 10 years from now. So it doesn't feel like the best sort of approach. And of course, the idea for a long time has been, well, let's shift this all to the markets because they've got more information and they generally do a better job than some kind of central command and control sort of Soviet era type of management. But that's not gone well. And it's not gone well, I think, because we haven't made that shift with enough sort of clear intent. It's been a bit half-hearted, and we've sort of then just looked at it and said, oh, it hasn't quite worked, let's go back to where we were before then, at least this time round. So it does feel like we need, it's time to think again about doing something different on this, something that allows a bit more technical neutrality, that allows a bit more market orientation to play into this space. And I've been a fan of this for a long time, but it clearly is very, very difficult. And the fact we haven't got there yet, I think, highlights a lot of issues with it, which I don't think are technical. I think they're predominantly institutional, and we'll probably come to talk a bit more about those in the rest of this debate.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, I think we will come back to some of those. So in fact, let's start with one of them now. So I think virtually everyone mentioned spectrum sharing. So let's move on to that topic. And let me first ask a general question really to anyone, which is, do we need to do more to promote spectrum sharing? And I guess the context for this is that, spectrum sharing is not new. It's been around forever, but it now seems to be being talked about as possibly, well, certainly one of the most important mechanisms, or one of the most important ways of trying to get all this additional demand and cater for that additional spectrum needs. So is it sufficient to say, well, spectrum sharing is out there, you can do it, as has been done in the past, or do we need to do something more to actually try and promote spectrum sharing? And in particular, do we need to do more to actually make it work in practice? Because it's often talked about, the number of conferences I've had over the years that have mentioned spectrum sharing, but take up remains, depending upon your point of view, it's limited still. So let me ask that question. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to leap straight in. So I would say we absolutely do need to do a lot more. And I think it's back to my kind of half-hearted point that if a regulator says, well, you can tinker a bit, we'll allow a little bit of sharing in this band that nobody really wants to go in because you won't do any harm in that band. And over here, you can fill in these forms, and if you're lucky, you'll get a bit of spectrum. And we'll see how that goes. And if that goes well, then fantastic. And I lived through the era of TV white space. I co-founded a company that was trying to make use of it. And the key problem was, unless everyone pretty much around most of the developed world opens that up, and opens it up in a way that is clear and allows a good amount of future certainty around its application, it's just not worth deploying any kit, and it's therefore nobody's going to make it. So it really has to be something pretty substantial. And if you think back to the early days of mobile, we had the GSM MOU of all these countries getting together to say, here's Spectrum, here's GSM, it's going to happen. And it took that kind of intervention to trigger an industry to really work well. And maybe we don't go quite to that extent with shared spectrum, but I think we need to take a pretty major step in order to convince people to invest in it and make it actually happen. And I think all we've done at the moment is tinker at the edges, look at it and say, oh, well, this would have gone okay, but let's go back to the old way of doing things because it's not quite there yet. CBRS, I think, shows potentially that if you do it in a band that's a central band that's already where there really is kit and really is demand for a service, then you could get really good take up. But we haven't really done that very much to date.
But if I mean, that's potentially quite a sort of regulatory interventionist approach. I mean, you mentioned GSM, which was essentially, a dictate, if you like, coming down. Similarly, what you suggested with TV white space would be, almost mandating that happens across a number of countries in order to create those economies of scale. So, I mean, would the panelists agree that we need some sort of more regulation to sort of almost make spectrum sharing work? If I'm not putting words into William's mouth.
Can I jump in?
Please do.
So, do regulators need to do more? Let me start from that perspective. The answer is absolutely yes. Regulators need to do more. There are no incentives in place to drive spectrum sharing, in my view. Obviously, CBRS is because that's a regulatory construct. But when new potential entrants see a band, they have absolutely no incentive to try to share. We need to define what share is, to share in a way that allows both the incumbent and new services to grow together. To evolve. What it usually means is the slow death or status quo of the incumbent service user at the expense of whoever is being allowed in. That's not sharing, at least not as I learned it growing up as a child. And so when we talk about spectrum sharing, the way we look at it is there needs to be incentives, there needs to be expectations created. So if we could borrow from the world of privacy that has privacy by design, and think about a policy that's sharing by design, where OEMs across the industry are incentivized to invest in R&D for sensing capabilities, for different capabilities that allow in different bands, because no band is the same, to coexist, and that the next evolution of their service will be more capable of sharing. Those are the types of things that I think are important. Spectrum sharing is too often, at least in some situations, the success of it can be measured in how much an auction yields or how much revenue is lost. Unfortunately, auctions often are a metric rather than a tool. And I think that's one of the things that challenges at least some of the regulatory discussions. And I'll say one last thing before I'd love to hear others' thoughts, but there's also a presumption sometimes in the regulatory environment that somebody that's new in the sense of not using that band has a regulatory presumption in its favor. That doesn't really lead to a balanced sharing discussion, right? Because what's the incentive if you think you're going to win the discussion? So those are just some things to maybe talk about, but working on cohabitation frameworks premised upon, incentivized R&D, even rewards for compatibility, regulatory rewards, just some ideas, maybe to stimulate some more discussion.
No, thank you. I'd particularly like to come back to the issue of incentives in a moment, but before doing that, let me go to Elif, if I may, and just ask her, because I think, Eric mentioned earlier that the the mobile sector was the big disruptor over the last 10 years, and has, you know, there's been a constant demand for more spectrum from the mobile sector as it's grown hugely, and to meet that increase in demand. But the mobile spectrum traditionally hasn't really shared spectrum. It's very difficult. Do you see that changing? I mean, do you see, particularly as you move to higher frequency bands, I mean, do you see the mobile industry being looking towards sort of spectrum sharing as a way of getting access to new spectrum, or is it a continuation of wanting cleared spectrum as has been traditionally done in the past?
Yeah, I believe that spectrum sharing has a potential. It's for sure. But as you mentioned, the mobile industry, the success of mobile industry is built on licensed spectrum up to now. The operators are paying high spectrum prices. The operators are investing a lot into their networks. All consumers are benefiting from these networks. And mobile has become the heart of several industries. Together with 5G, it will have more impact. And regarding all these, I believe that licensed spectrum will be a critical issue again in the future. But spectrum sharing is also a tool for accessing a necessary spectrum. If you don't have enough spectrum assets for a given industry, it's a way of accessing the necessary spectrum. So it has a potential, but I define it as a complementary to the licensed, exclusively licensed, I mean, spectrum. And there are operational issues, of course. Yes, we are talking about CBRS and other types of methodologies, but there are operational implications. I mean, if you have a nationwide spectrum that you can use freely, you have much more flexibility, agility. You have the condition of investing wherever the subscribers are demanding it. But if you have a shared spectrum, you have to consider the interoperator, for example, interferences. You have to consider if there is a management system to manage all these. And maybe the regulator has to host such a management system. So what will happen with the requirements? I mean, the agility. So whenever there is a problem, you need to knock into the regulator and ask for help. And the problems will be solved maybe later and later. How will the customer demand wait? So there are really operational problems or potential problems, let me say, for spectrum sharing. So once these are cleared, if there is a fair system and all these considerations are cleared for operators, it will have a potential. But these are really critical issues because you cannot, I mean, fix it on the way. So there has to be a concrete plan.
So Eric, I mean, let me go to you to pick up on these points. And thank you for that, Elif. I mean, CBRS has been mentioned a couple of times, and I think when it comes to sort of regulatory constructs, it's things like CBRS that are often mentioned, and these are obviously things that are being developed in the US to suit US needs. But my question, I mean, do we need to do more in Europe and in other parts of the world to actually promote spectrum sharing from a regulatory perspective?
Thank you, Grace, for the question. And well, first, spectrum sharing is part of our duty as spectrum management. We need to ensure spectrum efficiency, and it includes spectrum sharing. CBRS was a case very specific to the United States, because the prime interest of CBRS was to protect incumbents in this frequency band in US. When in Europe, it was easier to have no constraint at all for mobile operator, and I'm sure Elif and others are happy with that. limited constraint, which means possibility to deploy 5G without difficulty. And that's what US did then in the frequency band 3.7 to 4 gigahertz. Mobile operator wanted again exclusive spectrum with possibility to deploy with almost no limitation, including in terms of power of the base station. We have to promote spectrum sharing. There's a principle now in the RSPG opinion, which is use it or share it, and that's the first step, because I think we all recognize that mobile operator needs at some point of time or in some frequency bands some exclusive spectrum, but because it's necessary for the quality of service that they want to provide. But there should be some possibility to do more and to move away from the pure exclusive spectrum of mobile operator. Two example in France, practical example. We had one frequency band in 1.9 gigahertz, which was the unpaired band for the 2 gigahertz for the 3G spectrum, which was allocated to operator and which remained unused for 20 years. And it was impossible. There was some project, for example, for drones in this frequency band. There was project in France to implement some new services, and it was legally impossible. I know you don't have this difficulty in UK, in Ofcom, but in France, it was legally impossible because it was allocated to mobile operator. That's really a pity, 20 megahertz unused for 20 years. And also something like 10 years ago, we tried to promote in the 2.3 gigahertz spectrum some licensed shared access, enabling sharing between mobile operators and some defense use. And there was some nice project defined with the incumbent, so the incumbent was okay with that. And it did not succeed because the operators said, no, we prefer to have exclusive spectrum. So in fact, mobile operators say no to something which was additional spectrum. And I think we need to think about it. I mean, this difficulty of mobile operator to accept the principle of sharing. So even if there's a need for exclusive spectrum, I think they need to move more and more away from this practice of accepting only exclusive spectrum. And to say something about satellite, also some say criticism to satellite people. Sorry for that, Jennifer, but they have a good habit of sharing spectrum with fixed service and all that. So nice. But on the other hand, there are also often some difficulties with receiver parameters and filtering and overloading, and they need to improve some kind of practice here in order to accept not only sharing in band, but also some operation in adjacent band. I'm thinking about difficulties in the L band with the mobile, which will use the 1.5 gigahertz, and also in the C band, where the overloading was one of the difficulty or one of the element of the discussions when introducing mobile operators in the lower C band. Just to balance a little bit between terrestrial and satellite, William is correct. There's a lot of conflicts here, and it's good to be balanced.
So let me pick up on this, because I think there's some interesting points being raised here. I mean, firstly, I think one thing that is apparent is that spectrum sharing is not a single solution. So, for example, CBRS was a mechanism that was developed to meet particular needs in the US. Eric just outlined another case in France where looking at access to one of the bands that could potentially be used for mobile on a shared basis, etc. And I think that each one needs to be considered, I would say, on its own merits. I think there is a case to be said for the industry and all industry players to really think about how spectrum sharing and how they might need to think differently about how they approach access to spectrum, and including the idea of spectrum sharing as part of that. But I think Jennifer was first to raise the issue of sort of terrestrial satellite sharing, which is one of the ones that perennially comes up, although there are lots of areas where sharing always comes up between different sectors. And I guess that one of the problems that, as I see it, is that I mean, quite frankly, spectrum is so important to the industry, whichever sector it is, that no one is going to want to risk the access to spectrum. And actually, what that means is that they tend, you know, and totally understandably, whatever sector you're talking about, tend to sort of try and protect that access to spectrum because it is the lifeblood that they require in order to provide the service. But if spectrum sharing is really going to work, we've got to get the incentives right. And I said we come back to incentives. So how can we do, I mean, how can we do that? Because I sit in conferences like this and we often talk about spectrum sharing. And then I go into the ECC meeting, which I chair. And it's very difficult to sort of move some of these debates around how we do spectrum sharing. Everyone's very supportive at the generic level, but when it gets into the individual detail, it's really much more difficult and it's really challenging to get those incentives right. So Jennifer, what's the answer to that? Or anyone?
Well, if I had the answer, we'd be marketing it right this second. But in all seriousness, so it's a couple of different levels. I started, or in what I said before, I mentioned at least R&D, right? And I do think there needs to be some shared R&D work between OEMs in the space and wireless industry, so that they better understand each other. They better understand how the networks are deployed, the architectures, etc. Because there's very few integrated satellite and wireless companies, putting aside, you know, a little bit of ATC, or I forget the other terminology, the ancillary terrestrial component type. But there's very little, you know, integrated companies that really understand either industry or through the lens. And so if we want to get to a point that incentivizes, they've got to at least begin to understand so that you start to break down the problem. And then perhaps there are incentives that can be, so if a regulator, so if we think about the allocations are to services and assignments are to entities. And you look at entities, I'm not focusing on wireless, just any entity that might have many generations of licensed spectrum. Perhaps more licensed spectrum is only available on a shared basis because you can have license shared, if you know, it can show compatibility with something else, a non-competitor service, right? We've got to figure out how to do it, but then to make it sufficiently worthwhile in terms of those incentives. Nobody wants to have design requirements levied on them just for the sake of levying on them. You know, it makes equipment a little bit more expensive, and everybody likes to produce at a cheaper level, I guess is the way to say it. So we have to find what would make it is it tax relief? Is it faster amortization of equipment? I'm trying, you know, have to think outside the box, and it might be whole of government, not just what an individual regulator, depending upon what the regulatory jurisdictions are in each country. So I don't have the answer, but I do know it's not just a national discussion as well. Because as I think Elif said, we're having these conversations at WRCs time and time again. What we're not bringing is an understanding of even how potentially to share, just add another allocation, just add another identification with very little discussion or even education of people that you're asking to make a decision of what it means to say something's compatible. So we've got I think the incentives can only be had at the national level, but we've got to create an environment where you have national regulators in a lot of major markets working together. Because I think William said you've got to have some economies of scale, and he's absolutely right, for the vendors, whether it's ground systems or you know, mobile devices. Anyway, let me stop there. I don't want to monopolize.
And I'll just leap in on the I think looking at it in terms of incentives is the wrong way around. So I would say, you know, for example, imagine a world where every new license that's issued enables dynamic shared access to that onto the primary user of that license. So it's bought by somebody, whoever, a mobile operator, a satellite operator, a fixed link operator. They have the right to do whatever they want. So the mobile operators can deploy without any constraint whatsoever. but they simply have to register every base station whether they've deployed. And then dynamically, somebody can come in underneath them to access areas of spectrum that are not being used, with the caveat that as soon as those spectrum areas are being used by the primary user, they're kicked out. So there's no impact on the primary user, but now you've got secondary sharing. There's no need to have an incentive on that. That's simply a regulatory decision that this is how licenses are going to be in the future. And in some bands, it may be that there is no sharing opportunity because the primary user effectively makes use of the whole of the spectrum across the whole of the country, or they're likely to, and therefore nobody intervenes. Or it may be, millimeter wave for cellular only used in city centres and a few other cases by the mobile operators where they want high capacity, vast swathes of the country where others can use it and get in there and do things with it with a high degree of certainty. But that doesn't require anyone to be incentivized as such. That's simply a way of the regulator making more resource available.
But if we were doing that from the beginning, maybe, but we're not starting from scratch. And I think that's the challenge, William. I think that idea, 30 years ago, if it had been implemented then, I don't see that working starting from where we are. It's pretty hard to retrofit.
I agree. So, in principle, you could use it for any newly auctioned bands that effectively have been cleared and proposed and put forward for auction.
Well, auction shows a certain bias in favor of those that acquire it by auction. So I like to move away from the tool because not all regulators use that tool, nor is it necessarily the most even-keeled way of doing it.
Yeah.
So
and I think we
can have a debate on that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. The other place you could introduce it is governmental spectrum, essentially, because you've got more ability to impose upon government in some shape or form generally, because they may not have a license that they've purchased, and therefore there's more ability to do things. So I think there's areas you can, but I think it's an interesting thought experiment to then say, well, why can't we do that? And then look at the issues that block it, rather than simply saying, well, where can we apply it? Kind of think of it as the default and then think of the reasons why it can't be applied.
I mean, I think there's something to be said in relation to this in terms of just trying to change, or at least asking regulators to think about the question. I mean, there may be reasons for doing something on an exclusive basis, particularly if it's safety of life and things like that. There may be good reason for doing so, but actually it is a question that should be being asked. Can we do this on a shared basis? And going to sort of default exclusive licenses is not always the answer. But let me just sort of expand on this point of incentives, because I do think, it may not just be about spectrum sharing. But if as mentioned before, if I'm in a CPT meeting, but it could be any meeting around the world, WRCs, they tend to be quite adversarial at times. And I'd like to explore, is there a way of actually getting the sort of the industry representatives in particular, but also with the regulators there, to actually really sort of thrash out, what are the technical conditions, what are the assumptions that we should make, which are realistic, because no one wants to have interference, but we're not building up worst case scenarios on worst case scenario on worst case scenario. So you end up with something that's completely unrealistic. Is it feasible to expect people to work together to actually try and achieve something which is a bit more meaningful in terms of the right answer, or do we have to just accept that people will actually try and protect their access to spectrum at all costs, and therefore they're quite adversarial? Any views?
Very often, if I may, Chris, very often I think this is when we are trying to find some new band for mobile, this is really the newcomers, so the mobile industry, which has some difficulty to accept the sharing constraint. But it's not really a question of worst case, but remember 26 gigahertz, the production of Earth station in the 26 gigahertz, it was a difficult discussion to get it, when in fact it's only a few Earth stations which are existing or which may be deployed in the next 2 years. It's almost nothing, but it was creating a kind of difficult principle. And take another example, you express your frustration as ECC chairman that, okay, when coming to an ECC meeting, sharing it's too complicated. And take an example, 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, 6 gigahertz radio LAN. In Europe, administrations have decided that it would be the simple technical conditions, maximum 200 milliwatt and indoor deployment. In the US, that's something which is more complex, because they are allowing higher power up to 1 watt or 4 watt. I don't remember exactly, providing that there's a kind of geolocation database capability. So in Europe, so in CPT, in ACC, the decision was we take things simple and we don't want to have something too complicated. Where in fact, it would have been more, say, least restrictive, which is a magic word in Europe. It would have been least restrictive if we would have also allowed the geolocation database for higher power radio LAN. So why it didn't happen? And I think the reason is that US gets some experience with CBRS. So now they can just reproduce the same mechanism in other frequency band, and that's good. Where in fact in Europe, well, we don't have that. You have this in the UK with white space, but maybe it's too particular. And there's also the European dimension, which is creating another dimension of complexity. And US, even if it is federal, doesn't have this kind of difficulty because FCC is federal. So we certainly need to try to get some experience in that, in particular for this geolocation database solution. And I think maybe you could propose at your next ECC meeting that you open a work item for radio LAN with 1 watt or 4 watt in the 6 GHz based on a geolocation database capability. Just a suggestion like this. Thank you.
So thank you for that. I mean,
Chris,
Elif, I was going to come to you. Yes, please do.
Yeah, I also have a comment supporting Jennifer. Spectrum is a natural resource. So it sounds quite natural to share it, isn't it? But it's positioned so high and so precious and so expensive that nobody is even considering how I can share it with my colleagues from the other industries, the other operators, etc. So this is where incentives, the critical incentives take role. So there has to be incentives for a shared value, isn't it? This is my opinion. So if something is shared, it shouldn't be so highly positioned then.
I think we need to clarify what sharing means. I mean, we normally assume that I think means it means equally divided. So, you know, you get half, I get half. But in some of the cases I've been talking about, a sharing approach could be one where you get the primary use of the spectrum. I only get whatever you don't want to use. So you might get 99% and I might get 1%. It doesn't need to be 50-50. And in the case of a mobile operator, if you've got the primary license to deploy wherever you like, in whichever way you could do now, and I only get to use the bits that you don't want, then why do you need an incentive for that? That's no different from how you are now, isn't it? Apart from the fact that I get to use the bits you don't want, which I can't do at the moment.
So I used to call that, you know, hand-me-downs or leftovers, as opposed to sharing something. And I think, you know, I think if we want to have the technological leadership develop, it's got to be something which incentivizes the R&D necessary to get to these next stages of common sensing. Not common sense, but common sensing. And I'm all with Elif as well on the expense that governments attach to their access to spectrum, and perhaps incentives could be significant discounts to the operators in their auctions. If we must continue with auctions, there may be other ways to address assignments. But yes, the cost of spectrum, I can appreciate from an operator's perspective, is a disincentive to wanting to share. But when we're talking about at the allocation stage, and even when we get to the auction stage, if it's understood that sharing is expected and there's some certainty as to what sharing means, then even if it's auction, the auction strategy, the bidding strategy can discount for that use. So then the auction prices may not be as high, but the efficiencies may be much higher by more than one industry being able to effectively use that spectrum. So those are policy decisions. Those aren't market decisions, because it's a very different set of stakeholders because, as again, I said space, not just, commercial satellite communications. There's many other sectors that are affected here. And, I think we need to look at this much more holistically. So I think Alif and I are a little bit in lockstep.
And it is an interesting point, though, because I think it's a very valid point there, in that, I mean, sometimes in that sort of scenario of particularly with auction spectrum, depending upon what the objectives of the auction are, that could actually be run completely counter to promoting spectrum sharing, because obviously if your objective is to raise revenue, then that sort of sits with exclusive licenses. So I think it isn't just an industry problem to solve. It goes much beyond that and will include governments as well. I mean, I guess, I think, trying to get those incentives right is always going to be incredibly challenging, even if, that is the overarching government objective. One of the questions I was going to have, I mean, is there anything more that regulators, though, could be doing? I mean, and things like, or also, is there anything that sort of technology is going to do to help solve this? I mean, our databases and things, and we've talked about CBRS already. Are we going to see regulatory mechanisms that are going to enable more sharing, and also just the way in which regulators make spectrum available? I mean, it's no longer really just about sort of licensed and license exempt. There's all sorts of grey areas in between, and we're seeing more use of like licensing regimes and things like that. And will this sort of help to solve some of these issues by evolution, or do we need something a bit more radical?
So I think we have all the technology we need, and we have had for 10 years or so. So I mean, and to Eric's point, a database is not complex. A database is trivial. You can knock one up on your home computer, and it's not difficult to do. We're not talking about cutting edge quantum computing or anything like this. So I have very little sympathy for the argument that says, oh, it's all too complex to have databases in Spectrum. I don't think that's right. I think, in my view, the ideal solution actually may be a slight enhancement, in that at the moment with the database you have some sort of rules that say whether you think this additional access should be allowed or whether it will cause interference. Actually, there's no reason why you shouldn't have real life feedback. So there's no reason why the system that is potentially being interfered with shouldn't be able to report back to say, actually, look, things are being a bit degraded. My error rate just suddenly shot up for no obvious reason, probably interference. And the database to say, aha, better turn the power down on that interferer immediately, and better build that into future rules, that actually we've gone a bit too far in this case. So that I think isn't a step, but that's an easy step to build into systems. But I think we've got all the tools we need. We just need to say, actually, this is not that difficult compared to building a 5G network. That's bloody difficult. This is pretty trivial, frankly.
Yeah, I agree. It's not, William. I agree. It's not in terms of technology. There's no difficulty in this database. It's easy, and algorithms are easy to define, and there's no problem here. So the complexity is in the mind and maybe in the legal aspect, because here you need to change something. And when I was mentioning the European dimension, that's clearly also the case, because you need to manage things and to have some rules which are consistent all over Europe, to have something where you will find your economies of scale. So that's where is complexity. And to respond to your question, Chris, I think the current approach for license and license, that's okay, that's fine. If you have something which is with database, you can consider it from the unlicensed side or from the licensed side, and whatever you are able to cover all potential usage with the existing framework and these two broad category of license and unlicensed. So I don't think there's really need to have any revolution here. We just need to go in the practice of making geolocation and database kind of solution, and that's why I was suggesting the 6 years, but you may have some other ideas.
And just so carrying on that discussion, Eric, I mean, do you see this as something that needs to be addressed at national level, or do you think we need to do it more at the international level? And does that require any sort of changes to the international frameworks in order to make this work?
Well, for geolocation database, it's both at national level and at the European level, and European only, not international so far. But you have some experience in the UK with white space device, and that's something I remember all the set of regulations you had for this, because you need to define the database manager, and to have authorization for the database manager. There's a need to, of course, include in the harmonized standard some kind of provisions to ensure that the device will contact the database and get. So there's a lot of pieces to be defined, and they have to be discussed at the European level. But at the same time, all administrations have to think of the implementation at the national level in terms of what are the legal texts to be created or to be completed to ensure that this is something which can be done at the national level. I don't think there's any big complexity in that, but only some time, and probably we need to find a subject which is sufficiently motivating to get everybody working on that. I don't know whether 6 GHz is sufficient for that, but there's a need to have an experience on that, and then that will be spread in other frequency bands, even if it is less interesting, but just because the tools are here and people will be able to use it.
Could I jump in on that, Chris? Just to add, which is, so Eric went as far as the European level, but it really is at the international level, at the global level. This dialogue needs to take place where there is more transparency at the ITU level, for example, and it can be at other regional bodies as well. But there needs to be more transparency on spectrum sharing, on database management, on all the different tools. I mean, right in this group, we represent countries that have a lot of regulatory resources, very sophisticated regulatory resources that are brought to bear on this. But there's not a lot of transparency in the ITU process on all the underpinnings of positions that administrations take on compatibility in the ITU. So for example, when countries or regions are putting forward that A service is compatible with, B service, how they may have decided to implement that domestically ought to be shared as a recommendation or as a data point in some library of information at the ITU. So people other regulators can understand what are the complexities if we want to do this domestically, and that can create markets. It can kill some markets, but create others. Don't know which way these things will go, but at least it's on an educated and informed basis. Right now, I would argue that there's a lot of not necessarily intentional withholding, but withholding and reluctance to put some of that information into the ITU processes, or even to create not databases, I don't want to use that word, but repositories of practices. Because I've heard things about sovereignty, not wanting to tell an administration how they have to do something. At the same time, I would offer that that's a little bit of an excuse. I think administrations that don't have these resources are hungry for information, and the ITU is the right place to share that kind of information. Thanks.
Again, I'll be interested to explore that and see what others think as well, because to me that's a very different remit, if you like, for the ITU, an approach that is currently there. And I'll be honest, when I'm involved with the ITU, you tend to approach it as a negotiation. So if anything, you are quite limited sometimes with the information that you put out there, because it's a negotiation. You're trying to get what you want. And so, do we need to have an opportunity for some sort of more sharing of information? Would that be useful? And let me go to Elif as well. Do you think that the ITU and the WRC processes will meet your needs for sort of future access to spectrum, or do you think that sort of something a bit more that along the lines that Jennifer's just outlined in terms of actually sort of information sharing might be helpful?
Yeah. First of all, as a partner with the GSMA, one of the partners of the GSMA, I believe in WRC processes. They are securing the industry's well-being, the best results, they are giving a lot of effort into keeping the rights of everyone, every industry, etc. So I can say that I believe in it. But of course, in terms of processes, protocols, and everything, it's not much spoken. It's more on the technical aspect. I mean, the spectrum needs, how much spectrum do we need, what will be the future spectrum needs in very dense areas, which high band spectrums needs to be utilized or allocated. These kinds of information is flowing around and being discussed maybe for hours, but it's not about the protocols and the processes. And I would like to say that, for example, in my country, we are using backhaul and we are applying to the regulator for each and every access, radio link access. And it's yes, of course, there is a database, it's working, it's not incredible work, but because of all the processes ongoing, it takes months maybe sometimes to set up a radio link. So it's really not the technical perspectives, it's the mindsets, the protocols, the legal issues, as you mentioned, Eric. And so we need to figure this out. I agree with Jennifer.
And well, Eric, what do you think from the regulatory perspective? I mean, do you see any changes to the approaches through the WRC? And what do you think about this sort of idea of sort of, you know, more information sharing?
Yeah, I think there are two different subjects. I welcome what Jennifer is trying to do with ITU, and the difficulty is probably what William said at the beginning: too much conflict between community. And if there's one place where there's too much conflict between communities, that's really ITU and WRC. And the reason is because WRC is often a big battle to access spectrum. So it's really it's crystallizing, in fact, conflict in getting access to a spectrum. But in addition to that big battle that is WRC, you have also the normal ITUR work with recommendation report, and that's probably not sufficiently used in terms of experience sharing, not only within Europe, but with all countries all around the world, to ensure the good practice sharing and the possibility to learn from the other experience. And that's, I think, what Jennifer was trying to say. And then for WRC process, you know, it's clear that for mobile, it has been one of the key elements of the process for harmonizing and identifying the spectrum for mobile. And if the mobile spectrum is maybe not perfectly harmonized over the world, but quite well harmonized, it's owing to ITU and owing to WRC. And if you think about satellite and other usage, aeronautical, maritime, it's completely depending on ITU. One maybe of the common point also of satellite, all satellite services and all satellite interests. It's not only launching, it's the fact that you need to have some right at the ITU, just like an authorization, because in the space, the only one which is being able to record some rights, which are national wide, but to record some rights, this is ITU. So it's something which is unique in ITU for satellite, because in the United Nations system, this is ITU which is responsible for that. So there's something here which is totally necessary in WRC in this in making the allocations which are necessary for satellite to operate, and of course for other services, including possibility of harmonization for mobile industry.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, I totally agree that, you know, satellites are, or at least the ITU plays a role in relation to satellites, which is critical, which, you know, it doesn't play in relation to other sectors because of the nature of satellites, and that's an absolute given. But I mean, just going back a little bit, I mean, I would challenge you a little bit, Eric, in the sense that even in ITUR, if you go into those studies and what have you, I mean, I would I would suggest that most of the inputs into the development of those studies come from a particular perspective. And it's totally understandable that they do that, but they are generally looking for that study to prove something on this side or on that side, and to try and then potentially get that used in relation to a WRC debate. I don't think there's a part of the ITU which is really just there, you know, actually this is really sort of almost sort of academic type, you know, thinking, and this is what we've done, and this is, you know, what people can learn from. I don't know if there's any mechanisms from that could sort of, that could help that.
Well,
What about, Eric, what about the development sector?
yeah,
Could that help?
With the development sector work, I think was the question. D sector.
Yes, the development sector is something which is an area where you have this exchange of information, but at the same time, when there's some discussion in the development sectors, you only have few people really being able to speak more or less on behalf of different communities. When these people are massively present in ITUR meeting, that's why I think it would be better to encourage this kind of discussion in the ITUR. And I slightly disagree with Chris. I mean, when you have something which is related to WRC, you have always something which is oriented in support of a community and of a particular objective. But there are some more general discussions which are in, say, in a more positive and cooperative way. Of course, there's a development in terms of standard for IMTs, the harmonization for IMTs, for the time being, the 5G satellite also. That's a discussion which takes place in ITU. For broadcasting also, it exists for years. And there are also some information on spectrum management in ITUR study group 1s, which are helping a lot of administrations in implementing some spectrum management solutions, which are used in specific countries. So there are this cooperative also work in ITUR, but probably not sufficiently developed compared to the WRC preparations, which is a kind of hold up of all the energy in ITUR.
I think there's a couple of interesting points if I can jump. So first of all, I mean, stand back and look at WRC. It's clearly absolutely crazy that once every 4 years, 1,000 people or more descend on some venue, argue until they're completely exhausted late into the night, and come up with some decision that's going to affect the rest of the world. I mean, it is an absolutely ridiculous way of running Spectrum. So, you know, stand back from that and say, look, we've got to change this for the better. And the vast majority of things that go on there don't need to be there. You know, if you're talking about 60 gigahertz, for example, why on earth does WRC need to look at that? That is so local. Every country, or indeed every town, can decide that for themselves. There's really no need for global activity. And I think, you know, to the point to be made, clearly there are some areas that absolutely do need global activity, satellites being primary amongst them, but, you know, aeronautical and maritime and others clearly do too. And so, you know, there's definitely a role for a body like the ITU, but it doesn't need to do that through a WRC. It can do that through a more considered process. In terms of, could there be learnings and guidance on sharing? Yeah, of course. You know, for example, if we look at propagation models, ITU and others come up with propagation models. Commercial companies build those into propagation tools, regulators buy them and use them. I think we can have exactly the same for sharing, that ITU come up with generic rules on how sharing could work. Commercial companies build those into solutions. Regulators or others buy those and use them to deliver services. That seems to be a model that works pretty well, and I think could be done without, Chris, to your point, that one particular agenda being pushed too hard. Because if all you're doing is talking about a generic approach to sharing, then I think that's something that can be done by a group without necessarily being overly biased one way or another.
And William, just while you're there, I mean, let me ask you about you know, all the other Spectrum users, if you like. I keep categorizing them in that group, but particularly some of the license exempt community or the unlicensed community, and yeah, I mean, traditionally some of those groups haven't, you know, or they've argued they haven't done so well sometimes at the WRC. I mean, do you see sort of some of those new innovative uses of Spectrum and some of the sort of the applications we haven't thought of yet sort of bypassing the WRC process?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right that, you know, WRC is where regulators discuss. Regulators are influenced by their stakeholders, and they tend to be overly influenced by the stakeholders that have the biggest voice, and they tend to be the existing industry and not the unlicensed group. So you can kind of see why that naturally happens. And as you said at the start, Chris, we know unlicensed is incredibly important. In fact, vast majority of all traffic, mobile traffic, goes over Wi-Fi, not over cellular. So clearly, we need to make that link strongly. And it's always been a really tough choice between licensed and unlicensed. And I think the only way to break that is to effectively say, well, actually, let's blur this all a bit, and let's have both licensed and unlicensed effectively sharing through some form of database. And CBRS does that, of course. You have pretty much unlicensed access at the bottom tier, semi-licensed or at the middle tier, and primary users at the top tier. So there are ways, I think, that this could be blended more in the future, so it doesn't become a binary licensed versus unlicensed decision.
Thank you. So thank you very much for that. I think we're approaching the sort of the end of this panel, or towards the end. So before we finish, I'd like to give everyone the opportunity just to make some sort of final remarks or anything in the reflection. Let me sort of couch that in a final question, if you like, from me, which I'll run round to everyone, which is, in 10 years' time, I mean, how might spectrum management have changed, do you think? I mean, and will we be sitting here in 10 years' time having a similar conversation, or will things have moved on? And what were the challenges we would likely to be facing at that point, do you think? But also, if you've got any final remarks you want to make yourself, then feel free. So let me pause and see who wants to go first.
Okay, I'll jump in. So I have the advantage of not repeating anyone. So I'm hoping we're not having this conversation about the moon in 10 years' time, that we have exported our problems there. But in all seriousness, I'm hoping that in 10 years' time, with the application of AI and machine learning, and really the regulators being able to kind of get the human out of the loop, but not abdicating regulatory responsibility, we will have a truly shared environment with pockets of exclusivity for kind of control places for networks.
Thank you for that. Who wants to go next?
I'll happily jump in. So I would love to be able to say, yeah, 10 years from now, the world will be a different place. Everything will be run through databases. Everything will be shared to the extent that it's sensible to share it, and so on. But then I reflect back, I joined Ofcom in 2003. So that's 18 years ago, at which point we thought we were not far off this solution. Regulators, unfortunately, for very good reasons, I'm not being critical here, I think just as an observation, changed very slowly. WRC happens once every 4 years, we'll have gone through 2 in 10 years' time. Will anything change materially? I would love to say yes, but my gut tells me, nope, we'll be exactly in the same place 10 years from now, sadly.
And do you think that's a problem?
Yeah, I do, actually, because it will have meant that many innovative applications that could have emerged and many more efficient uses that could have happened will not. And therefore, the world will be a poorer place as a result.
So one optimistic, one pessimistic view there, I think, or who wants to go? Elif?
Yeah, I have a pessimistic view as well. Given the 4 years time frame, 2023, 2027, in 2 meetings, I don't think that we will handle all of these. Of course, there will be enhancements in software, AI-based algorithms will be introduced. I'm sure there will be progress, but will it be enough? And also, in terms of all these economical perspectives, I don't believe that in 10 years it will change a lot, maybe minor.
Eric, and then I'll come with a final question then about what we can do about all of this.
I don't know if it is optimistic or pessimistic, but I don't think it will be very much different in 2030 or 2031. There will be new possibility with technology, new tools, market tools. For example, the incentive auction of US, that's something which was quite new. So there will be some new tools, but basically it will not change. But I don't think it is so bad, because I don't have maybe the same views on whether there should be something different possible. I remember also the discussion with Ofcom 20 years ago when William was there, discussing about complete change in terms of spectrum management, and I think the reality that you cannot just by some economics, you cannot solve elements like the political complexity, the technical complexities, the need for harmonizations and all that. So I don't believe in this magic economics which will enable to solve spectrum management difficulties, but it's not really a problem, because we are able to solve the real life difficulty and spectrum management allocations with the tool that we have, which are improving over time with technology and some market mechanism, and that's okay from my side.
But is it okay? Because I mean, if there are, as William just suggested, the potential services there that aren't going to come to fruition because they can't get access to spectrum, is that a real concern in France?
Who is not able to go to get access to spectrum? Give me some name.
So my take is that we should have in-building cellular in all our homes, and to do that we need to have pico cells that we can self-deploy with shared access to spectrum. If we had that, the capacity of the cellular networks would be increased at least 5-fold, maybe 10-fold. Power consumption would reduce dramatically, and we would have a very, very different kind of world. But that can't happen without shared spectrum. So there's a concrete example of something that won't happen unless we dramatically change the way that we manage the spectrum and manage the approach to effectively sharing.
I think for this one, it will be solved not only in 10 years, but much before. I mean, what you are describing, it's an issue which is in the mind of people. I mean, spectrum manager, regulators. So there will be some solution on this one, like we are discussing very much vertical local access, and that's something which will be solved also in the next 3 years. So there are some new use of spectrum which are requesting some specific legal or technical solutions, but that's progressing in this respect. So in 10 years, this one will be okay. I'm optimistic.
Okay, so we can perhaps end on an optimistic note then in that case. I mean, my conclusion for what it's worth from this is that there are, I think, perhaps slightly different views across the panel over the need for change in terms of our approaches to spectrum management. And where I think there is greater agreement, though, is that there won't be radical change. And that's not because everyone is agreed that it's not necessary. I think it's just everyone's in agreement that actually it's whatever your view on whether it's necessary or not, it's not going to happen. And actually what we're going to continue to see is an evolution of the current approaches to spectrum management. I guess the other big unknown in all of this is the impact that sort of technical evolution may have in respect of spectrum management, and how that may impact our approaches to promoting spectrum efficiency. I mean, Jennifer just mentioned AI. I don't think we'll even go there at this point. I mean, that may be a debate for a future discussion in terms of how that may evolve and what that may mean for our approach to spectrum management. So I think on the technological development side, that there's, it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But I think on the regulatory side and the policy side, I mean, I think we are effectively saying, yes, there'll be evolution, we'll have some new initiatives, but it will be more of the same. On that note, I think that's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you ever so much for your time and for participating so actively in that debate. Really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. And I hope it's been interesting to everyone that's been listening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Chris.